Welcome to Legal Connect, where each week we sit down with top lawyers to demystify the process of hiring and working with legal counsel in today's world. From navigating the legal system to understanding your rights, our expert guests provide valuable insights and tips for anyone facing a legal challenge. So tune in, take notes, and join us as we explore the ins and outs of the legal profession. A quick disclaimer, anything discussed in the podcast is general tips and advice, not formal legal advice. Always consult a lawyer. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Connect podcast. I want to start off this podcast today with a land acknowledgement that we are carrying out our business today on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Qelmūcw, Musqueam, Squamish, Katzie, Kwantlen, Kakwa, and Stolo peoples, and we extend our appreciation for the opportunity to work on this territory. And my pronouns today, as I've just learned from Andrea here, I didn't just learn them, but my pronouns are she, her, and wiyawâw. And Andrea's are she, they, and wiyawâw. So I'm going to just kind of start with a little bit of introduction of our guest today. So Andrea Menard, she is a Métis person from the abolished Red River Settlement and is a Métis Nation of Alberta citizen who has over 25 years of experience in relationship building with Indigenous nations across Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, as well as the Métis homeland regions and with Indigenous nations in the unceded lands of British Columbia, in the government, nonprofit, legal, regulatory, and academic sectors. And she was also voted Canadian Lawyer Magazine's top lawyer. And that was just this year. Is that correct?
That was September 2022.
Okay. So last year. Okay. Well, congratulations. Yep. That is a huge accomplishment. And we're definitely going to talk more about that as well, which I'm very excited to get into all of that. But yeah, welcome to the podcast, and I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Thanks, Rochelle. It's great to be here. Do you want me to do my land acknowledgement?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So I am a guest on the west part of Treaty 6 territory in Qelmūcw, which means Beaver Hills Lodge in the Cree language. This is the homeland of the Papaschase, or the Papasteo nation, and was established as part of Treaty 6 in 1877. But Canada annulled it 11 years later in 1888. The Papasteo were pushed off the land, and they were made to move further south of Edmonton. But then they were expelled from that land base as well. They were left landless. I acknowledge and understand that until Indigenous peoples living on these territories and across Turtle Island regain our sovereignty and self-government, that until restitution is paid and truth is unambiguously communicated, that Canadians are all participating in and benefiting from colonial violence. Miigwech, Marci, hi.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. Thank you for that. But yeah, I guess let's just kind of start things off by talking a little bit more about you and your career. That's the reason we're all here today. So yeah, I would love to know how you ended up getting into the legal profession, what kind of brought you to that point in your life, as well as just feel free to share a little bit of your background as well.
Well, okay, yeah, so I'm Métis and a white-passing Métis person. So I grew up in two worlds, the white worlds, because I'm half settler, half Métis, so white world and Métis world. So growing up, I noticed that my Métis family, they had barriers, and I didn't understand what those barriers were, but they weren't doing as well as my white side. I saw my white side somehow doing better, and I didn't understand why. So I noticed how Indigenous peoples, when I was growing up, were being treated in northern British Columbia in that Tene region, Prince George, where I was raised. And I didn't understand why Indigenous peoples were on the streets and being treated that way. Then I went to reserves and didn't understand the reserve system and why. And I saw what happened on reserve, and I didn't understand what was going on in the 70s and 80s. So I started delving deep into my Indigenous roots. And from there, I just kind of fell into law. So I wanted to be a social worker, but actually social work was harder to get into at UNBC in Prince George than law was.
Wow.
Everyone wanted to be a social worker. So I got into law. I got into law before social work. So I went to UBC, down where you are, in the traditional territories of where you mentioned. And, it's Musqueam territory at UBC. So anyway, I did that, graduated in 2004 with a law degree. Then I got a master's of law from Osgoode in Toronto in 2020. So I didn't want to live in the big city. So I moved into central British Columbia and Williams Lake, BC, and articled there at a boutique firm. But I really wanted to practice Indigenous law, and they weren't doing that at the time back in 2004. So I left, and I worked on reserve for the Williams Lake Indian Band. It was called the Indian Band back then, Qelmūcw. So I learned a lot working for Williams Lake First Nation, and I have really strong ties to them still, and really good memories of that region. And we did treaty negotiations, so we negotiated with the province in BC for treaty rights, for new modern day treaty rights. And I saw the community's reactions to that. So from there, I left and I went to Edmonton. So I've been on Treaty 6 land since 2009. So a few years there, and I've been in and out of academia. So I would go into academia and work at the law schools. Then I would leave, and then I'd work in communities. And then I'd leave, and then I'd work for government in Indigenous communities and see that. Then I'd leave, and I work for legal aid. Leave, work for law societies. So I'm more of an experiential person.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. You can bring out your expertise and your experience to all these different areas, right?
Right. So I'm not just stuck. So now, as lead educational developer, I'm not just stuck in the ivory towers. So I have real world experience, not only as an Indigenous person myself, but also my experience working with communities in various capacities. I can bring that experience and knowledge and depth to the classes that I teach, as well as to the professors that I teach across the university, as well as the judges that I help out in the western part of Canada. So yeah, it's a very interesting position I kind of sort of created for myself. But yeah, I'm having a good time doing it.
That's amazing. Okay. And I'm curious too, you mentioned the experience. So it was can you repeat again, in Prince George, it was the Indian Band of...
So I worked for Qelmūcw.
Yep.
That's the Williams Lake First Nations, they call themselves now. They
right.
changed it from Indian Band to First Nations recently.
Right. Okay.
So for modern day treaty negotiations, so that's still going on in British Columbia through the BC Treaty Commission.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I worked...
Experience, what was that like actually being part of that negotiation, and what challenges did you encounter as part of that experience?
So I learned a lot because Qelmūcw accepted me into their community. And that was a real blessing. I've never felt so like I belonged anywhere. And that was an incredible experience. So I worked just outside the band office, so in a different kind of section. And we were the negotiation land and rights title office. And I'd see wild horses gallop by, and I'd see all sorts of things. Anyway, so it was beautiful working for them because I understood Indigenous laws and Indigenous cultures, and I understood how to communicate effectively with Indigenous peoples, and I understood the strife in Indigenous communities when it came to signing a treaty. Mm-hmm. So, and I started to understand more about the division of the chief and council with the chief and council at the time. Right now, there's a great leader there, but sometimes there's a division between chief and council and then the rest of the community. Mm-hmm. Because chief and council, more or less, are under the Indian Act, and they have to report to Canada. Whereas the community, a lot of them are more traditional people with grassroots knowledge. They have the knowledge that will keep Indigenous peoples, alive for many generations, from many generations past, for many generations in the future. These people have the medicine. So it's really interesting to work with Chief and Council, who have a different kind of agenda, the province of British Columbia, the feds, as well as the grassroots community members. So, it was difficult work, but it's the work that I wanted to do. So I was really grateful that they allowed me to work with them and allowed me to pass the message on that their land rights matter, because I did a lot of the land rights categories. So their land rights matter. And then I got to see the province's response and the federal response. And in fact, the BC Treaty Commission, they still haven't gotten anywhere. So, it's not the best process. And why isn't that the best process? Because they're not utilizing Indigenous laws.
Right.
So part of that is why I wanted to change our racist structures in Canada and our racist processes in Canada by incorporating Indigenous laws and Indigenous ways of knowledge, because it's just not doing anyone any good. Everyone is still stalling out. The Indigenous Nations are still not signing treaty. They don't want it.
Right. And coming back actually to how this connects to law, I wanted to ask you, because I'm sure you would know best being in education and also having this background, is I know that is it the University of Victoria now has an Indigenous law? It's the first Indigenous law program in Canada, is it not?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so can you explain, I know that you're working with the University of Alberta now, but is that something that you think is maybe on the horizon for the U of A? Or have they really looked into how that program's gone? I think they're still on their first 3 or 4 years of it, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the director of the program is Dr. Val Napoleon, and I used to work under Val when she was at the University of Alberta, and I was the director of Indigenous academic services there. So from 2009 to 2012, I worked under Val, and that's where I learned her processes. That's where I learned about Indigenous laws. She was my teacher, even though I was, I worked under her. I really learned a lot. So she was the one that created this JID process at UVic. So it's an extra year that law students have to take, but they learn Indigenous laws.
Yeah.
And how to implement them in our common law and civil law systems. Wow. And so right now they have Wokotowin Lodge at the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. And Val kind of sort of helped Wokotowin Lodge get established at U of A. So I don't find that it's going to be a huge leap to maybe perhaps establish an Indigenous Juris Doctorate program at U of A. But already the Wokotowin Law and Governance Lodge is there, and they're doing a really great job. So we're slowly but surely changing things, and slowly but surely working on changing the upper echelons, because I'm telling you right now, students are hungry for it. Students get it, and it's a groundswell moment. Right? It's the top people, they don't get it, but it's the groundswell of a lot of my own students at the University of Calgary Faculty of Law. They get it, and they want to do more. They know that things aren't working. And this is one of the ways through my course, Reconciliation Lawyers, at the Faculty of Law, University of Calgary. I also teach another course at Osgoode Hall Law School, which is Reconciliation Dispute Resolution, and then Wokotowin Lodge at U of A, but then of course UVic has that incredible program. So so I think they've graduated now. I think maybe it's 5 years old. So it's good
see the first Indigenous lawyers coming, or they're exclusively working as Indigenous lawyers now. Well, at least in the Canadian system, right?
So Val's JID program, Juris Indigenous Doctorate, is to implement Indigenous laws. So actually, Indigenous students can go into that JID program, or they can go into the regular program.
Yeah.
And non-Indigenous students can take the JID program. So we have Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students learning Indigenous laws and how to implement them. And it's up to them whether they want to practice Indigenous laws getting out, but they have that knowledge now. So it's slowly but surely, you're right, slowly but surely, we're coming up. It'll be, maybe decade before things really changed, but I'm hopeful.
And why do you think it's so important for, not only like law students and all lawyers pretty much, and judges and everybody in the legal system really, why do you think it's so important that people have an understanding of the Indigenous laws and like the Indigenous legal system and are able to practice that within our do you think I guess two questions, can it be practiced within our context, or does it have to exist as a separate system? Because I think people maybe have that question as well, right? Like, how can you practice both within the same system?
Okay, why is it needed? Because we should throw the current law system into the dumpster and light it on fire. Okay?
I love that. Yeah.
Okay. So the legal system, the colonial legal system as it stands, is not working for anyone today. Indigenous peoples, it especially isn't working for them. But historically, it hasn't worked for them. It's oppressed them. Indigenous peoples, we could not represent ourselves until 1969 when the Frank Calder came. The law profession has historically oppressed Indigenous peoples and still do today. We think we're doing the right things, but we are not. We have to change our processes and structures because we are operating under an oppressive process and structure. That's called colonialism, right? People have to begin to understand that. It makes people feel uncomfortable, but people have to begin to see things are not working. Now, the current stats on Indigenous peoples being incarcerated are sky high right now. So things are still not working. We created the Gladue system in the criminal court, and we thought that would help reduce Indigenous peoples getting arrested and incarcerated, but it's magnified now. So what are we doing in law with the Gladue system that this hasn't worked? So Indigenous people have our own laws, and we don't listen to colonial laws. So if you watch Indigenous peoples in court, we're really pretty apathetic because we really don't care, because this is not our system. Mm-hmm. So we don't care if we get put in prison. We don't care about our records. We don't care, and it ruins our lives, but we don't care. It's not our system. So why are we in this? We usually plead guilty. We usually get the worst of the treatment. So lawyers have to learn how to communicate with Indigenous clients in order to tell Indigenous clients what is really going on and how that's really affecting them. Now we see a divide where no one's getting any sort of education, and people are thinking if someone has a Cree accent that they're drunk. Right? If someone's talking with an accent, people don't even understand that Indigenous peoples have their own language. Right? So they see the accent, they're like, oh, that person is stupid and drunk, and we're going to not represent them properly, and away they go. So, okay. So, yes, we can weave Indigenous laws and ethics into our current colonial common law system, and people are trying. Right? So yes, that's a good way. I call it the hybrid way. But a better way would be to have it separate. But I don't think Indigenous law is just for Indigenous people. I think Indigenous law is for everybody, because the current legal system is not working for anybody except for the rich and powerful. And the rich and powerful and white privileged people are getting less and less as capitalism, neoliberalism grows, and we're middle class is getting poorer and poorer. So I believe that Indigenous laws will help everybody and heal a lot of people, because the justice system doesn't work for anybody, and people leave disappointed, they feel betrayed, they have no clue what's going on. Indigenous laws would help that. Now, the reason why Indigenous laws are important is because now there's huge gaps in the system. There's huge divides, and Val Napoleon describes it. That's where the utmost violence occurs, is in these deep chasms where colonial law cannot heal these deep chasms that we've created in colonial law because we don't understand marginalized people, diverse people, or Indigenous peoples. So Val Napoleon says, okay, well, we need Indigenous laws because they go to a deeper root. They go to a deeper root instead of this surface type of problem that will only exacerbate it in the future.
Right.
So that's why we need Indigenous laws, whether we do it in a hybrid way, whether we do it in an all-encompassing, like, okay, no, we're totally separate. But I don't think it should be for Indigenous peoples only. I think it should be for everybody. Whether Indigenous peoples, we practice it first and we can bring to the courts later, that's fine. But I really believe in the strength of Indigenous laws. Indigenous laws were here first, thousands of years before Canada became a country. Canada is a relatively new country. And this is our first laws here on the land. So why can't we be implementing them and recognizing them?
Absolutely. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a lawyer, but the Canadian system is also based a lot on the British legal system, right? Which also is obviously very colonial and not really reflective of where we are in today's moment, right? A lot of it is very antiquated, very outdated, right?
Absolutely. And it causes oppression to Indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples and peoples who don't fit into this powerful and privileged white elite Eurocentric system. And we're seeing the answers today. So people can't be sweeping it under the rug anymore. We're seeing the answers. We're seeing more violence. We're seeing people try and speak out and protest and say, look, we need more answers to the issues. You're not doing a good job, Canada. And why aren't we seeking more and moving towards reconciliation? So the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action have called upon all Canadians, have two calls calling upon lawyers and law universities. So universities and lawyers to say, change the system. Change the system. And law is quite a conservative profession, but law also gives people who are in law the power and the flexibility to change the law. We just have to change minds in the law.
Right. I was going to say too, I'm curious, like, especially with the work that you were doing, because I know that you're in a few different areas, right? You're kind of been in academia, you've been in negotiations, like you've been all over the place and you're teaching these courses now. How are you, like, what steps are you taking to start incorporating some of these Indigenous law perspectives and some of these foundations into not only the University of Alberta's curriculum, but also just maybe into just the law in general? Like, what kind of steps are you doing or working with your team to kind of accomplish? I know that there's probably a lot you're tackling with that. It's a big portfolio, obviously, right? But
oh yeah, no, it's tough. Okay, so people don't know how. They say, Andrea, how do I do this? And then my students, especially, they say, I feel like I don't want to be a performative ally. I want to do it properly, right? Because they don't want to be fake. So and they don't want to appropriate, right? Mm-hmm. So Pooja Parmar is a professor at UVic. She's amazing. She created an article. It's called Reconciliation and Ethical Lawyering. So Pooja says there's a really tricky fine line because of allyship, because what it is, it's new age colonialism. So we have to be really careful as allies that we're not oppressing Indigenous peoples, right? Now this is like, so if I start off with this, people just like give up on me in the class, right? They just give up. So what I usually do,
it's an important place to start, though, right? You know.
Yeah, and it's uncomfortable and it's difficult because this is a new burgeoning practice. So, for instance, the Orange Shirt Day, for National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, every September 30th, right? So everyone was wearing orange shirts, and it's becoming big. It's a big deal. But now, my Indigenous colleagues and communities are saying, okay, everyone is too happy. We have to make it so that it's more of a somber event. So I noticed it's constantly fluid, it's constantly shifting because people are adapting. People don't really know because Indigenous peoples were very fluid, we're very responsive. And so now it's not cool to be smiling in your orange shirt. So this upcoming 2023 National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I think is going to be a bit different. So it's a new burgeoning avenue and way of doing things. So what I do is I start off with Pooja Parmar's article. I start off with class being introduced to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous elders, and the Indigenous elders will tell the class what they can do. Because Indigenous people, they're not even invited to class half the time, right? So no one hears the
conversation, right? Yeah.
I know, right? So I invite Indigenous community in, and then what I'm recently basing everything on is the 7 grandfather teachings. Now, this is an Anishinaabe teaching. So Anishinaabe are over in the Ontario area, but you can translate it across Indigenous cultures across Canada. With I start off with the 7 grandfather teachings. Now, they're wisdom, truth, love, honesty, courage, humility, and respect. So I start off with those 7 ethics, and I ask students where they are in regards to their law journey or their academic journey right now in regards to those 7 principles. Then I do critical reflections all the time, because reconciliation has to do with learning, unlearning, and relearning. Because what we've learned up until now has not been adequate whatsoever. So I do critical reflections in learning, unlearning, and relearning. And as they write in their journals, and they hand in critical reflections to me, that gets them into their heart space, out of their head space and into their heart space. And this is where Indigenous peoples want everyone to go. We want everyone to go into your heart space. I know that sounds really fluffy in law, and no one wants to talk about their heart space in law.
Yes, it's what we know of lawyers, right? Because there's all these assumptions that, it's very cold, it's very logical, it's very rational sometimes. But I think the best lawyers are the ones that are in their heart space, and they're more in tune with all those 7 teachings, in my opinion, at least, right?
I know, right? So I kind of teach the opposite of what people are learning. And I teach professors this too at the University of Alberta. I teach them to get into their hearts, and I teach I tell them about the 7 ethics, the 7 principles, the 7 grandfather teachings. And I'm saying, what are you doing? How are you incorporating your ethics into this? How are you incorporating it? And they're like, no, there's no way. I can't. If you talk about love, that's creepy. You can't do that. I'm like, no, if you want to practice reconciliation, you have to unpack a lot of the things that you've been learned of how to be a colonial teacher, how to be a colonial lawyer, how to be a colonial academic. The Indigenous world is completely opposite. It's like a 180-degree turn from the colonial world. So I ask people to do a lens shift. You got to put your different type of lens on and start to really do some heart work and really try and come up with new ways of addressing things, looking at things, addressing the law, looking at the law. And I tell them they're not going to have any friends by the end of this, because they're going to be made fun of. There's no friends in this type of work. This is really hard work. It takes a lot of courage to do this work. People will isolate. You will be isolated. People will judge you. People will laugh at you. But I want to tell you that Indigenous peoples will applaud you, and we are rooting for you. And that's what law is about. I believe law is about working for the underdog. Here you are in this really privileged and prestigious position. Why not do the work that's needed? Why go further and further into La La Land doing this corporate colonial work that only, serves you and your nuclear family and 3 other people in the firm? Why not think of the rest of society and how that's going for people? Why not do some really hard work as a lawyer? And for the younger generation, they see it more acutely than the older generation, and they're ready.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important, obviously, that you're working with people at the academic level, in law school level. I'm curious, have you ever done any work with firms that are already out there and established, where because I feel like it would be even more difficult to go, speak to these people who are very ingrained in their ways, who have no conception of this, that are maybe a little bit older.
Yeah.
Have you ever had like that experience, or have you mostly up to this point been with like the younger, like the students?
Oh no, I've had backlash all over the place. So it's really hard for lawyers and I try to reach the young, the students at law school first, because I know once they get out into the profession, they're going to be swamped and they're not going to be able to look back. So I try and plant that seed in law school, because it's really hard to guide lawyers. Because number one, they're tired. Number two, they're extraordinarily busy. They don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to understand what I'm telling them. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to get through to lawyers. And number three, they get mad at me because I make them feel uncomfortable. They're not used to feeling uncomfortable, and I make them feel uncomfortable. So then I get backlash. And dealing with a backlash is really hard, because I work within colonial systems. So colonial systems will say, okay, Andrea, you're disobeying, you're being, you're not, towing the racist line. And of course I'm not towing the racist line. I'm trying to make a difference here. Of course, Indigenous lawyers are not going to fit into your firm, big firm. I'm here trying to tell you how not to say, oh, you're just not a good fit for the firm. That doesn't speak to diversity. It doesn't speak to Indigenous peoples. You have to change. And I do get a lot of backlash. I do get backlash from students as well, and I'm ready for it. Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised, and I'm ready for it. What I'm surprised at is that I'm completely unsupported, isolated, and waffling out into the space on my own. But luckily, now I have younger people who are bosses and leaders at the university who understand the work that I'm doing. And they say, Andrea, we support you. We support your processes. We support Indigenous law. We support that we're on unceded territory and we are on stolen land. We understand that, and we understand what you're doing, Andrea. So luckily, with the younger generations, I have an understanding.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm sure they appreciate that too. And like you said, the ones that want to make the change, once it might even take a generation, right, for those lawyers to graduate law school to then get jobs, but they'll remember those teachings, they'll carry them with them, even if, at some points, like you said, maybe it's not accepted or they're being isolated. At least they have those teachings inside of them still. They're not gonna unlearn them, hopefully, right?
No, right, because I've already warned them. So what's happening is that I'm really glad to see that there's more students supporting one another. So then again, I tell students, don't be a bystander, because I see a lot of white people being bystanders, or non-Indigenous people be bystanders. So I tell the students, get out there. Don't go and sit by the wall when kind of something's going on. Don't move to white innocence. Nice racism is happening in the workplace. Go and intercept. And you know what? They get a mark against them. I say, be ready for it. So what I'm doing is I'm preparing them to be unpopular and giving them a choice if they want to do that way, or if they want to do it another way. Because I've seen some things. I've learned the hard way. I've seen my non-Indigenous ally friends who are brown and black. I've seen them get in trouble. I've seen Indigenous colleagues get in trouble. So I am encouraging people to step forward and to intercept. But it'll take a while, because it's really hard for white, privileged, and powerful people to get in there. It's really hard for them to move from white innocence and into, okay, something's wrong here. So I'm helping them out, but they have a choice, because what happens is they don't get the promotions, right? Mm-hmm. It's a scary place to be. So then I ask them, what's important in life? Is your career important? Okay, then play the game. Is justice important in the ways that what I'm talking to you? Okay, then learn how to step forth and know that you're going to be taking a risk with your career.
Yeah. And kind of speaking more to the public now, like I know we've talked a lot about like, what law students can do, kind of like what, professors can do, even like what people working at firms can do. But for people of the public that want to kind of see this legal system change and like see like more room, and that includes Indigenous people as well, like what can we do as just like non-lawyers, I guess, to help support those changes?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so read books, follow Indigenous people on social media, attend powwows, there's like super awesome Indigenous fashion designers out there, Indigenous artists. Yeah, I know, right?
Well, I went to Vancouver Fashion Week this year, and I'm blanking on the name, but there was a great, I'll have to look it up, I'll have to find it, but there was a great Indigenous designer, and her collection like just stopped, like the entire show was just like jaw-dropping.
I know. So there's Indigenous. So what I do also when I teach is I teach in an indirect way. So I teach like through multimedia, right? So I teach about Indigenous artists because artists bring the difficult messages in an easier way sometimes, in an indirect way. So like fashion, art, people who want to know the message in different ways. I say, whatever way works for you. Please, follow artists and advocates and read as much as you can, and attend events and, get out of your comfort zone and be friends with Indigenous people.
Yes, yeah, it's important.
But yeah, so what do I do for the public? Yeah, so there's lots of things, but it's a very uncomfortable journey for the public. So I do book clubs. I have this authentic allyship project for the public is across Canada, and it's with another co-academic partner, Mark Bala, and he's in Toronto, and of course I'm in Waskagan, Edmonton, and so we do this cross Canada authentic allyship project. So we do book clubs, we do resources, we teach, we do presentations together of how to not be a bystander. So I have that as well for the public.
Yeah, one other thing I want to talk about, and we actually talked about it before we were actually recording, but we talked about the importance of language and how understanding the language actually almost illuminates a lot of the concepts and the values and beliefs that Indigenous cultures hold, right? So can you explain why it is so important to, I know how you mentioned things like, Indigenous language books, they're in the foreign language section, even though they were the first languages in Canada. So like, why is it so important for us to not only like learn the words of this language, but how does that help with our understanding and like ability to, I guess, understand and support Indigenous cultures better?
Right. So when I talk about the 7 grandfather teachings, the Indigenous ethics, people think I'm crazy talking about love, wisdom, courage. Like they're like, what is this fluffy stuff? So if you know an Indigenous language, you will understand this. So what English does is that it just creates nothing but dissonance. Like it just, Indigenous people are constantly misunderstood because of the English language. Learning an Indigenous language, we're non-binary. So Indigenous languages across Turtle Island, North America, and probably the world. So we're all related to everything. We're related to the rocks, to the water, to the air, to the plants, to each other, to everything. Knowing an Indigenous language would help us expand our vision, open up our bandwidth for understanding how life works, understanding how and why Indigenous peoples do things in the way that we do things, understanding about empathy, compassion, equality for all things. So Indigenous languages are non-binary, so we're all related to one another. And knowing this helps. So I'm not just saying with, the United Nations Declarations for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with that coming into Canada and the new act saying, hey, we have a new Indigenous Languages Act, everybody. Okay, Indigenous peoples, learn your language. No, this Indigenous Languages Act is for everybody across Canada to learn the first languages of this land. The first languages of this land were not French and they were not English. They are Indigenous. And knowing this, I think, would help heal us and also understand the land that we're on, as well as understand how colonized things have become. It's a disaster now. So as I was mentioning to you before, I go into the library, Cree language is under the foreign section. It's abysmal the way that we've done things. And the Dewey Decimal Point, I think, is really hard to change in the library system. So I'm like, that's another thing. Let's champion next, Rochelle, is the library system. Make Indigenous languages the first languages in Canada, not in the foreign section. I mean, that's so
it's
telling.
It's a small change, but it's just a small change that could signify a lot, right? So
it's so telling where we're at as a society. And some of my friends, they speak their Indigenous language, so they speak up in class. They're speaking Cree or Michif or Anishinaabe, and then people are like, "This is Canada. We speak English here." And they're like, no, this is my land, and the first language of this land is my language. So we're speaking my language here. So there's a lot to overcome. And I know that different personalities can do different things. So the gentle approach can work, but I'm tired of being gentle, and I do the hardcore approach, which makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable, but I'm now supported with the change in society. I've got some good people backing me up, and people are starting to listen now because things are changing, not for the better, and things are like, okay, we've got to have different solutions here, and maybe they're Indigenous solutions.
Yeah, I've always believed too that the most growth happens in the times where you are the most uncomfortable, because if you're comfortable, you're not changing or progressing, right? Like it sounds kind of cliche, but I think you have to get in those uncomfortable places, right?
I know, it is so interesting to me when I encounter lawyers and they're resistant to change and they feel uncomfortable, and it's like a big deal. And here, I would feel uncomfortable in court arguing with this judge in front of me. Like, what are you doing feeling uncomfortable with me talking to you about, like, I don't understand this, but it's hard.
Yeah, it's going contra, they can understand the law is black and white in some senses, even though not really, but, they can understand that, but when it comes to something that maybe changes the perspective, it's harder to wrap their heads around, perhaps, maybe.
I know, right? And I'm not like that. I'm the opposite, right? So I'm always like, oh, okay, well, I've made you feel uncomfortable, and then we got to work through that. Why are you uncomfortable? Let's do a critical reflection. And so the older lawyers, they never ask me back. But the younger people, they're willing to go for it. And people from different cultures, they understand.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, this is a perfect kind of transition to kind of close out the conversation, and we've kind of touched on it, I think, a little bit, but what is your vision for the future of, not only legal education, but the legal system in Canada, let's say 10, 20 years, it's a little bit broad maybe, but what is your vision for the future, and how do you see everybody kind of coming together to make some of these things happen?
Well, Indigenous peoples have to be in leadership positions, full stop. Because we're not in leadership positions, because we're not judges, because we're not prime ministers, because, we don't have the power to change things. So you'll see EDI in organizations, and the EDI people are all white. Then they'll have a woman in there, right? Then they'll have two, maybe people from different cultures, brown and black people in there, maybe. But those brown and black people can't make the differences that a leader can. And leadership doesn't want to change. The only place that I've seen in my life people change is if they're getting sued.
Really? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess it makes sense. Yeah.
So I've worked for duty to consult. So you have to consult with Indigenous people. So I worked for the duty to consult in the provincial governments, the government of Alberta and the government of BC. So when Indigenous communities come to the government and say, look, I'm going to sue you because you're still not doing it right, that's when the governments listen.
Right.
That's
right.
That's the only time. Now,
maybe we need it more often. We need it more frequently, I guess, right?
Oh, totally. So I'm glad I'm in law because I know the law, so I can say, hey, look, you have a duty to consult with Indigenous people. You're not doing it. This is the law. Let's continue on. Indigenous strategies are now coming to the forefront. So, for example, the University of Alberta has an Indigenous strategic plan. So I say, okay, you have goals, everybody, faculty, departments, colleges, you have goals that you have to implement before year end. How are you going to do that? So accountability measures are coming for people who don't understand. So it's really interesting to see this people turn the corner because they have accountabilities that they have to answer to now, which is good. So Indigenous peoples in leadership or accountabilities every year.
Yeah, two very important things, and I hope that we continue to see more of it, because if not, what other choice do we have, right? Yeah.
Well, we'll just have to wait for the younger generation.
Yeah, that could take a while, though. That could take a little bit of time, right? No, that's great. And I guess just to kind of finish up, I want to ask just a couple of quick questions, let the audience get to know you a little bit better, maybe on a personal level. Yeah. But it can either be a book that you read recently or a book that you've read at some point that had a big impact on your mindset or the way that you think. It can be when it comes to, Indigenous issues, or it can be when it comes to just anything, really.
Mm-hmm. So I'm reading White Women by Sierra Rao and Regina Jackson. And I mean, it's a no holds barred book about how white women are complicit in racism and colonialism, and how white women can be our greatest allies if they start to understand their roles. See, it's like people aren't understanding things, and so that's what Regina and Sierra are getting at. So this book is incredible because it's really hard hitting and it's really truthful, because usually everyone just butters things up and puts a flower on top. This is like, no, we need to act now, and white women, you're coming with us, and this is how you're coming with us. You're going to unpack all this stuff. You're going to dismantle all this stuff, and you're going to learn how to be our allies. So
specifically, I'm curious.
Right, because, okay, yeah. So, I know it's unfortunate that white women, right? It's always on the women, right?
But
it's always on women, no matter.
That's what I'm curious. I want to know, how can women? What unique position do we have to?
Because you're kind of like more of a in between position. You're a mediator, because white men listen to you more so than they will listen to an Indigenous woman or a Black or brown woman, right? So, and they say in this book that white women are just thinking they're our friends and they're our buddies and they're really doing a good job because of feminism. And they're not really understanding intersectionality or race. So Regina and Sarah are talking about race and intersectionality and telling white women, you can be our strongest allies. You have to understand that you're not doing a good job, and here's how you can do better. So they're putting white women to the task about talking to the white men, the white privileged and powerful men.
I think even if I remember back to when, I think it was was it 2016 when Trump, trying to block it out, when Trump was first elected, I'm pretty sure that white women was one of the swing kind of categories, probably for that reason, right? They can go either way, and their power as a group has a big impact on the outcome. I think, if I'm remembering that correctly, it was one of the groups that was like a big determinant, right? Yeah.
Yes. So CBC GEM has what they did, right? So they invite a whole bunch of white women over for dinner, and it's called Discomfort in Dinner, Decolonizing Dinner with Sarah Rao and Regina Jackson. You should see it. It's so uncomfortable. I mean, I wouldn't want to be at the table, right? Anyway, so it's about this white women saying, it's white women moving to innocence. So when I see white people move to innocence and other people who haven't done their work, and it's really hard work, they move to innocence right away. They say, okay, well, why am I involved? I don't have any part of it. I'm a good person. I'm married to, a person of color. What does this have to do with me? And then this dinner that they're all having, Regina and Sarah just like, it has everything to do with you. It doesn't matter who you're married to. It doesn't matter what children you have. You can't sit there in your tears. Your tears and crying are making it harder for brown and Indigenous women to state what we're feeling and how it's impacting us and the impact of colonization upon us. You have to help us. And here is how you can help us. So they're putting it on white women. So yeah, so that's what I'm reading. And it's like, it's a page turner.
I want to check that out. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I always get like book recommendations during every conversation we have on this podcast. So I'm going to hold myself accountable and put myself in an uncomfortable position and pick it up. So
no, you have to. And then the CBC gem is, let me find it. Deconstructing Karen.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, okay. I won't forget that one. I will not forget that one.
Yeah, so watch that today.
Yeah.
That's them in action. It's really uncomfortable.
And then one other thing I wanted to mention, because we talked a little bit about like social media and different art forms and things like that we can consume. Do you have any like go-to people on social media that you love to follow or you think are great leaders or voices in the community that people can kind of turn towards?
Like the snotty nose res kids.
Yeah. I've heard of them. I'm in the scene. So yeah.
I love them. So they're doing I want to tell you, it's the Indigenous artists that are making the headways here. They're just creating the language in order for all the rest of us to take the steps needed. So I love, he's passed away. I love Richard Wagamese. I love the way he writes. So of course there's the movie out on his book, Indian Horse. I love reading about Indigenous authors. So I'm currently reading as well Terra Nullius by an Australian Aboriginal author, and learning all about what happened to Indigenous peoples in Australia. Similar history, similar violence, similar genocide. So, so I follow Snotty Nose. I follow Indigenous fashion designers. One is local here in Edmonton. I can't remember her name, but I love her. She's famous. She went to New York.
Oh, wow. If you find it, let us know and we'll put it in the show notes.
Okay. And then who else? I can't remember who else I follow. So I follow Idle No More.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yeah. So that's it's with Sylvia McAdams. She's one of the founders of Idle No More. So I always follow their posts. So Snotty Nose Res Kids, Idle No More, and my Authentic Allyship Project. If you want to put a link in, we have stuff that we follow.
Yeah, can you talk actually a little bit more about that too before we go? Like what I know you kind of like started touching on what you guys are doing with the project, but yeah, how do you join? Like, can anybody across Canada join, or how does that work?
Yes. So it's called the Authentic Allyship Project, and so a non-Indigenous academic partner, Mark Bala, he's biracial, he's South Asian and maybe white, and he's born in Hong Kong, so he's not even a settler. So he's an immigrant and then settled in Toronto. And myself, Métis, Red River Settlement, Treaty 1 area, but grew up in Lheidli. So him and I are collaborating on how to be an authentic ally, because a lot of people have questions. And we have like a multimedia approach, really gentle, kind of jazzy approach to being an ally with it not being as uncomfortable. So we have this website out, we have a book club, we have people that we follow, we have resources, we have like we interview artists. So Bear Grease, I don't know if you know of Bear Grease. It's like a play on Grease. You know, Grease the play. Yeah, anyway, Bear Grease is called. And so one of my Indigenous friends is an actor in Bear Grease. So we highlight Rodney McLeod in Bear Grease. We highlight poet Norma Dunning as well. I love her. She's an Inuit. She's an Inuk poet, and she is just winning all of these Governor General awards. So we interview people. We're going to be interviewing Jennifer David from The Path, which is the cultural competencies training that Alberta lawyers had to take, that they didn't want to take. And that big deal that happened in early February with them wanting to scrap The Path. So I helped co-create those education modules for all lawyers to take with Jennifer David from Envision. So we're going to be talking about that this week at the Authentic Allyship Project. And we're going to be broadcasting The Path and the Indigenous cultural competency training that the lawyers had to take and didn't want to take.
Wow. Okay. We'll tune into that and definitely drop the link for that so we can all, check out the website, find some of these resources you're mentioning, and even connect with you. Is that a good place to connect with you as well? Or can you kind of plug where people can find and connect with you online?
Oh, right. So I have my own website for people to look on, see what I'm up to, see what I'm doing, see my approach. So yeah, I'll plug in my website. It's www.indigenousconnect.org. And then, of course, everyone can email me at andmenard@gmail.com. So I'm open to everyone and ready to go. But yeah, Mark and I for the Authentic Allyship Project, I think we do have a contact us. So you can contact both Mark and I if you want to know more about how to be an authentic ally. So, and then Mark and I will get the message and away we go.
That's awesome. Okay, that's amazing. Well, I think that's we've given the audience a lot to, I think, process, but then also a lot of resources where they can start to continue on this journey of learning. So I thank you for taking the time to obviously come and speak to our audience today. I would love to have you back in a few months and maybe we can do a more specific topic if there's something that's top of your mind or something like that, but we can definitely have you back on if the audience, I'm sure, will demand it. So
I hope so. I hope they like me.
It's important conversations to have, and it's nice to have someone who isn't afraid to lead those conversations, right? So I'm getting to the point in my life where I'm going to be like Regina and Sierra with no holds barred. Good for you. And everybody grab that book as well. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to leave the audience with today? Just any parting words or messages of support or advice or?
No, I'm happy to be part of LaTeX. I'm really excited about the future of law and the future of Indigenous law and incorporating the reconciliation principles and incorporating Indigenous ethics. And I'm so pleased that LaTeX has accepted me. I'm so pleased to be here today to talk with you and everybody else. So thanks, Rochelle. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Legal Connect podcast. We hope you found our conversation informative and helpful in navigating the process of hiring and working with a lawyer. Make the process of hiring a lawyer easier than ever and ensure the best match possible through our platform, latex.com. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.